program. My relationship to this is if you've read the book Vaccine Epidemic, and if you haven't, I may force a copy on you before you leave the conference. I wrote a chapter in there about the role of government and media in the autism epidemic and what they've told us, what they've told the public, what they've reported to the public. And, and the key kind of piece of that story over the last 10 years has been the Hannah Poling case. In 2008, after many years and decades of denial that vaccines had any relationship to autism, we learned from a Johns Hopkins neurologist who had a registered nurse for a wife, and that their daughter, who has full syndrome, diagnosed, DSM-diagnosed autism, had been he'd been compensated from the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program following her 18-month vaccinations, which included MMR and DTaP and several other vaccines. And then the question naturally became, if vaccines don't cause autism, why is this family receiving millions of dollars? And CDC's response to this was, this is rare. And Julie Gerberding made the statement that the Hannah Poling case should not be generalized to normal children. She would not explain what normal children were, because Hannah Poling looked completely, she was a normal child before she was vaccinated. She had no signs of mitochondrial disorder, and the government was claiming it was the mitochondrial disorder that caused the vaccine reaction. But really couched in a language that Hannah was just a bad receptacle for a fabulous vaccine. Not that the vaccine was to blame. It was the child that was, kind of defective. And again, that this was so vanishingly rare, that this is nothing anybody should concern themselves with. And the language they used was very just playing games with autism-like symptoms to make it sound like she didn't have autism, but Hannah has full syndrome autism. So our community, kind of after getting, okay, you've made the determination that there is a relationship here, explain your understanding of this relationship, of this case you're compensating. No explanation was forthcoming, and we just got more games. And so we started asking each other on Facebook, who else has been compensated? And the following week, another family came forward. And then a year later, another family came forward. And then CBS investigation found 10 more cases. So we had 11 cases that we knew were out there. And Lou was not satisfied with not having an answer, so he decided to file a FOIA request to find out how many autism and autism-related cases had been compensated from the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. They have compensated more than 2,500 cases of vaccine injury through that program since 1988. I believe is the year they got it up and running, and a little more than 1,300 of those cases were brain encephalopathy cases, and encephalopathy is the medical term for brain damage. So how many of those cases that were diagnosed encephalopathy, the symptoms of which include loss of eye contact, not seeming to recognize your family, seeming disconnected in the world, that was a description of my son following his DTaP vaccine, for which he was diagnosed with autism. So how many of these cases are related? So Lou filed a FOIA request, and he got a response that said, we'll be happy to give you that information. It will take 5 years, and it will cost $750,000. Which, if you can't legally keep the information from them, just keep it out of their reach, because so we don't have those kind of resources and whatnot. So Lou, being the enterprising guy that he was, who's a law enforcement officer and runs a sex offender program in New York, is very familiar with the court system, and said, I know the court system. I'm going to go start plowing through dockets and finding judgments and see what's going on in these cases. And what came from that was eventually a paper published by EBCALA, which is the Elizabeth Burt Center for Autism Law and Advocacy, where they went through the published cases and found 21 cases that had language of autism-like symptoms, children that were receiving ABA, and just had the language in it, like Hannah Poling did with her autism-like symptoms. And then as Lou found more and more kind of names, he would get the information of just the name of the family, the name of the child, the attorney's names, and the judgment that they were awarded. And so he and Abkala started making phone calls, just saying, hey, how many families can we find? And just ask them, does your child have autism? Do they have autism-like symptoms? So the Abkala team found 150 families and took oral histories and said, tell us about your child. And of the 150 families that they found, there were 61, is it Mary, 61? 62. 62 more cases of autism-like symptoms, all of the descriptions. They found even more cases, actually, of parents who described an autistic child. However, like one family who was talking to, they said, well, our child has cerebral palsy, but as they were talking, they were describing one of our kids. They didn't include those children in the autism cases because it was by parent report, it was the oral history, whatever the parent said is what was documented. So if these children were actually evaluated kind of blindly, there may be more cases even in the 150 that were found. But the end result of that is, of 150 families, 83 of them had an autism-like scenario described by their parents, either an autism diagnosis or autism-like symptoms, and that's more than 40% of that sample, and it may be even higher back in that little sample. So the question remains, if we had an actual medical evaluation of the cases in the compensation fund, how many quote-unquote DSM-4 diagnosable autism cases would we find? And why wasn't anybody paying attention to this? These cases were being made as far back as at least 1990. Even before that, I think 1990 was the earliest ones. So that was, 20 years ago, we had evidence that there was a Vaccine Autism Association. Nobody followed these cases. Nobody said, hey, you know what, we need to examine these cases. Bernadine Healy came out, I think it was 2008, and said, it's time to study the children who got sick. And there's been no effort to go back to, we've heard parents who've come out on Fox News after following saying, no one ever called me to see what was going on with my child and see if my child had autism, what was the outcome. So the end result of this paper is, it's not a scientific study, it's, oral histories from parents. So what needs to happen is a responsible government would say, hey, there's a problem here. We have a significant portion of the population now choosing not to use the CDC vaccine schedule because they don't trust it anymore. This is causing some serious ripples. Even if they had no belief that this was the case, they have an obligation to go back and look at these cases and look at these families. So what Abkala has called for, and we would hope that everyone joins us in doing so, is to put the burden on the government to explain themselves, to explain these cases, to look at these kids and find out what are the health outcomes for these vaccine injuries, for these encephalopathy cases. What does it actually look like? What does it mean? Enough with the word games and the autism-like symptoms and the, super kind of autism-y like children. What is the real outcome here? And let's deal in good faith on this. Good faith is something that's very hard to come by when you're dealing with the medical establishment and vaccine questions. So where this goes from here is, if you've been on Facebook, you've seen some canaries. And really what this paper, it was entitled Unanswered Questions, has become to our community is, this was 20 years ago this started. These were little canaries in the coal mines that could have prevented the illness of the children of almost everyone in this room. If they were paying attention, if they truly cared about public health, then they had a chance. And in my opinion, I don't think that the people involved in this should be trusted anymore because they have failed and they showed themselves to be not responsible with the positions that they've taken. And they need to be replaced by people who really care about the neurological and immune system health of our children. So. So, this segues